My guest today is Michael Girdley, and Michael is the creator of a holdco business. Basically, he holds a bunch of companies together that include fireworks, software, school, coffee chain, and in some, they total more than $100 million. I'm not sure if that's in revenue or profits, but I can assume that Michael is a pretty successful guy. He's been in business for over 25 years. And the reason why I had him on is because I stumbled across him on Twitter, and this guy has built a following of over 140,000 people in the past 2 years. And he's really interesting. And we had an incredible conversation. And I've listened to Michael on a bunch of different podcasts, and no offense to the other podcasts, but this was Michael in a different form. We talked a lot about business. We started talking about fireworks, but we also talked about why and what the differences are between generations. We spoke about why some of Michael's best ideas and companies come from his leadership group. And this was Michael in a setting that felt a lot more natural. And it was just a great conversation with somebody now I consider a mentor and a friend. Hopefully Michael considers me the same. And I just really enjoyed getting to know Michael in this way. And if you follow him on Twitter or have heard him on a different podcast before, this is him in a different light from my perspective. This episode is brought to you by My First Million. My First Million is the podcast that I listen to and check out whenever I want to learn more about entrepreneurship, business, which if you're listening to this episode with Michael Girdley, you're probably interested in. So check out My First Million for all of the great stuff on technology and business. One of my favorite podcasts, and in my top listening, I pretty much listen to every single episode. So if you enjoy this one, you'll probably enjoy that one as well. And you could check out the episode Michael was a guest on as a good starting point if you've never listened to that show before. I will also please kindly ask you to subscribe wherever you're listening. You're listening on YouTube. I know there's no video version for this episode, and I apologize for that. They're coming in strong in 2023. A little upgraded video setup that's coming. But if you're listening on YouTube, if you're listening on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen, please hit the subscribe button. That helps me tremendously because it ensures that you will get new episodes downloaded or brought to you better than any way that I possibly can. So hit that subscribe button wherever you check out the podcast. That would mean the absolute world to me. Subscribe. That's all from me. I'm super excited to bring you this episode with Michael. And please let me know your thoughts on Twitter at @HeyDannyMiranda. Okay, let's get into the episode with Michael Girdley. One of the top 100 most influential Texans in 2022. How does that feel?
It's amazing. I don't know. It's the Business Journal, so they're nice people, and but it's cool to be there, amongst the other 25 San Antonians they picked out. So pretty fun.
Yeah. Well, I want to really dive into your story and what you've accomplished in this brief time on your floating rock in space, and I feel like a good place to start might be with the fireworks.
Yeah.
The fireworks, tell me about how that journey unfolded.
Sure. Yeah, so we today own one of the largest, if not the largest, fireworks vendors in the state of Texas. So that all actually started when my grandfather came back from World War II. They had choices about where they wanted to live, and they originally spending time in Kansas. My grandfather was born in a little tiny town east of Dallas called Wills Point, which is just where like two railroads stop. It's pretty small. So he had met my grandmother during the war, and they were out in California because he was in the Pacific, and decided that they wanted to go someplace warmer, and they liked the attitude of San Antonio. It's a different kind of place compared to other places in the United States. So her uncle had been in in the fireworks business, or her brother had been in the fireworks business, so my dad's uncle. And his name was H.P. Cannon. And so they came back after the war and started like becoming a dealer in fireworks. They would go to China, and my grandfather was the first person to import fireworks from China directly into the state of Texas. So pretty fun. And so, my grandfather was this awesome guy who was much more concerned about being everybody's friend and being that life of the party than he was being like very competitive, which is different than how his my father and then me, like I'm hyper competitive, different than how we all came out. So he came back and he started being what was called a jobber. So you'd import fireworks and you'd sell them to retailers. And then my father got into the business in the 70s when they had about a dozen locations. And so he did it for going on close to 30 years and then got close to 60 around 2003, 2004. And that was when I was living in California, and said, hey, would you like to come back and run this business? Because I'm sick of working. And I was like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So at the time I wanted to leave California. I'd been sick of working for other people and I wanted to be entrepreneurial. And I was kind of sick of being in California. I was kind of bored of it. And my wife didn't like the cold aspect of San Francisco. So I was like, I know a place where it's really hot, like Africa hot, like super hot. And so we moved back here, and then I ran that business for about a decade. And that was really my first CEO job. And anyway, I can go different directions than that. I can tell you how the fireworks business works, which is a fascinating thing. But it was also like, as I look back on it, it was like the most amazing training ground for learning how where the rubber hits the road type business, because it's so hard. Like every other business I'm in feels like easy mode compared to fireworks.
Why is that?
Okay, so fireworks is this hugely seasonal business. And when it's seasonal, a lot of things kind of spiral to make it very difficult for you, right? So, a normal business, let's say you're doing like a property management business, like every month is same as the previous one. There might be a little bit of seasonality, but by and large, like you wake up one day, you fill tenants and spaces, you make sure, sinks get unplugged, and you do that the next day. And it's pretty easy to run a business that just runs like one day, same as the next, right? You have quarterly feedback cycles and all that kind of stuff. And also, you have a situation where, because you're running those kind of businesses, like a normal business, like your information loop is quicker, right? Like, have you heard of like OODA loops and stuff like that?
You could explain it for people who might not be familiar.
So yeah, it's a military call. It's just this idea of, well, maybe since I may brutalize it. It's this military idea of you go through 4 steps in terms of gathering data, orienting, making a decision, and then acting on them. And that's an OODA loop. It was put together by this guy who was how would you describe him? He was like a thought theorist, a decision theorist inside of the military. And he figured out that the organizations that do those OODA loops the fastest were the quickest learning organizations, and then they won. So the problem with a seasonal business like fireworks, where maybe you're selling once every 4th of July, or in our case, we sell here in this market twice a year, New Year's and 4th of July, like your feedback loop, there's nothing you can do to shorten it from a year. Right? Like what you learn right now on the 4th of July, you can't apply that for a whole nother year. And like that becomes super difficult in terms of running your business. It's seasonal, so it goes way down, way up. And then the cash flow kind of sucks, because like right now we're selling fireworks here in the state of Texas. We started December the 20th. We legally can't sell after midnight on January the 1st. Oh, wow. So we won't have any revenue come in until June of next year. So you like have to figure out how to be capitalized through that whole situation. So it's very fascinating.
Oh my God. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is that it's funny or interesting how July 4th and New Year's are the 2 times that fireworks are allowed to exist.
Yeah.
But why don't fireworks companies try to figure out ways in March and September to also make a profit?
Yeah. So there's a couple different things. Trust me that every single fireworks vendor has tried. Like we tried to get into the Halloween business for a while, and I can tell you the dynamics there that make it very difficult. People tried to get into roses. They tried to get into Easter stuff. Like all of those things are just very difficult. And you have that combined with, it's tough to do those things. And then on top of it, it's like there's a significant opportunity cost. So like, you're going to go get into Halloween, and every fireworks vendor got into Halloween and then got out of Halloween. Wow. Like the last holdout that I just knew, he had been like the past couple of years been like, hey, like, we've got this Halloween thing figured out. And then I talked to him like a month ago and he's like, yeah, we gave up on that. It wasn't a good idea. I was like, I could have told you that. But yeah, and then there's the opportunity cost, which is, would you be better off just going to open one more fireworks location that you know how to do that really well and you can make a lot of money doing that? Or do you want to go jack around with maybe trying to figure out how to sell Halloween costumes and compete against Spirit? Like in the end, it just doesn't make a lot of sense from a focus perspective as well.
Makes sense. What was the initial inclination to sell fireworks?
For my grandparents?
Exactly. Like way down the line. Like I'm just thinking like, what was that the Instagram or Twitter of the day? Like, let me get exciting information. Like, let me bring entertainment to people. Like,
yeah. Well, is it different? I'm a little older now. I'm 47. So like, I remember a time in which we were still like faxing stuff. But even before that, like my grandfather grew up in a time, when television, much less that device you have right there, like didn't even exist. So they were trying to find entertainment any way they could. Like they were drinking heavily. They were like doing whatever they could. They were having lots more in-person parties. My grandparents used to have these rager parties. Like we'd hear about them.
Oh
like,
my God.
Yeah, they had like one of those. It was the coolest thing when after they passed away, we cleaned out their house. And we had like this crazy, like one of those organs, like playing organs. Cause they were just like, back then it wasn't like you could put on, a dance mix, right? Like back then you had to like put some paper into this thing and like it would blow little holes through and it would play organ music and everybody would get, drink 14 martinis. And that's how it would go. So, but ultimately like fireworks are fun. Like I like them a lot because of two reasons. One is, it really is like one of the last pure things that when you go see what people do with fireworks, they like go out as a family. Like it's something everybody can do. Like the little grandmother sits on her chair and she talks with the grandkids and like the teenagers are out there doing stuff and like lighting fireworks or running around. Like it's one of the kind of the last cheap all family entertainment things. And so it's really great because that's basically what our business does. Like we have this thing called the Happy Memory Guarantee, where if you don't have good memories from coming and shopping and then using the products, like come talk to us and we'll make it right. And like, that's, I think the core kind of beautiful thing we figured out about the business is we're not really in the fireworks business. We're in the, how do we help you make like happy memories and fireworks are just the tool of that. And the other thing, I think the world needs a bit more opportunities for people to kind of push the edge a little bit. And even if you have like the simulation of danger, right? Kind of the roller coaster thing where you're like, well, what happens if something happens to this roller coaster? Well, it's probably safer than you were driving over. And fireworks are kind of like that too. You really have to work with modern fireworks to hurt yourself. Like whenever you hear somebody hurt themselves, it's usually because they were a complete and total idiot, like every single time. So like, I think the world needs more of those type of things. Like just one of the complaints I have about like modern playgrounds. Have you ever noticed modern playgrounds are like super boring?
No. I haven't spent a lot of time there.
Yeah, they're super boring. Like when I was a kid, literally when I was a kid in the 80s, the playground, they had like an old rusty World War II airplane that they just took and let rust in the playground. That was our playground. And like I remember getting into it one day and I was like, this doesn't seem very safe. There's like shards of glass everywhere. And we were fine because we were like Gen X, or like, okay, we'll take care of ourselves. But one day I looked in there and there was like a black widow spider, like 6 inches across. And I was like, yes, this is why my generation is so tough. This is beautiful. But it's kind of also why like a lot of parks and playgrounds are so boring and kids aren't that excited. It's because, well, the world needs a little more danger, or at least illusion of danger, in my opinion.
That's an interesting take. I want to go back to the business aspect of it. And it was easy, I'm sure, to have a fireworks business and be like, I'm going to stay in this fireworks business forever.
Yeah.
Why do you look further? Why do you go beyond fireworks?
Yeah.
What was the first step into the unknown of the next business?
Sure. Well, I think some of it's just the way I'm wired, right? Like, I think one of the core kind of drivers I have is just this idea of always wanting to do stuff higher leverage, like, or maximize things, right? And like, we talked about like my thread this morning with Twitter, like I'm getting kind of pooped on because like I wrote this thread that's like, here's how I've spent the last 2 years like totally optimizing my AV setup for Zoom. And people are like, you're a loser. I was like, well, actually, yeah. But that's just this kind of higher leverage nature that I have. Like the second I see like I have to do some work, I'm like, how do I do less work? Or how do I make this better? Or how do I figure out how to make this higher leverage? And that's really just a core like of how I'm wired. And I mean, I think, and I like to think that a lot of that comes from humility of realizing the things I just suck at, right? Like I'm just totally comfortable being bad at things and also not liking things. And I remember a time when I was running our family business and I was a CEO and I've been doing it for 5 years and I couldn't figure out why I was unhappy. And I went on a 3-week vacation and I came back and everything ran better than when I'd been running the company. Like I was like, man, like I think the universe is trying to tell me something. I may not be very good at this, you know? And I think everybody has this idea that you as an entrepreneur, like, or a podcast host or anything, like you're the absolute best. Like you're destined to be the best person in the world to run this business. And I think at that moment I had the realization, I was like, man, I may not be as good as I think I am. and that really presented an opportunity, I think a relative amount of freedom where I could say, oh, if I'm wired to want to do this higher leverage stuff and I know what I really like to work on, like, why am I forcing myself necessarily to do something that probably somebody else could do better than me? And I could just spend my time making them really successful. And that was the genesis of kind of going from, okay, how do I just have one kind of bet of a company, you know, in my ownership portfolio to this kind of multiple like ownership idea.
So what was the next step you took?
The next step was I was a wimp. I didn't actually quit the first job, but in parallel, I started to carve out a few days a week to build a second company. And the reason I found out about that opportunity was I started to spend time here just right across town at a place called Geekdom, which is a co-working space, but really it's not a co-working space. It's designed actually as a place to bring together kind of like-minded entrepreneurial people. And I just started going to spend like one day a week there. And I take my laptop over and like just hang out and like try to find other like-minded entrepreneurial folks who were maybe trying to figure out the rest of their life too. And I was like, well, like best way to learn stuff, I'm going to start doing things. So I started like writing angel checks and I started like, you know, being stupid and like trying ideas and getting people's feedback on them, just trying to go make things happen and give to the community and see what happens. And I kept talking to people over and over again. And like, everybody was like, we can't hire software developers in San Antonio. I was like, okay, well, that's pretty interesting. And I just stored that away. And then I read about this company and this is the emergence of kind of coding boot camps. I read about a company in Seattle that was doing it. And I was like, I could do better than that. So we just copied them. And we started a business here called CodeUp. And I was CEO of both companies for a period of time, getting that off the ground. So I invested money, I recruited a couple of co-founders, and we like started a business, started to take people's money and give them value.
I love how you've said before that a great entrepreneur mixes curiosity and humility.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's what you were doing in building that second business.
Yeah. I agree with that 100%. When I said that, it sounds really smart.
It is smart.
Yeah.
So like, I guess, what gave you the confidence to go for the next, you said, or you wanted to go for another opportunity. And it's like, you said you were a wimp. So like, how do you not become a wimp?
Yeah. It's like, I don't know a great way to fix it other than mindfulness. Right. And like this idea that like as a younger person, and I guess we're going to hopefully talk sometime today about like mistakes I wish I hadn't made when I was younger, but like there's this whole thing of like kind of spotlight bias and like worrying about what other people think, or like, are you going to be a failure? And like eventually and too slowly, I think I got to a point where I was just like, wait, none of that really matters. Like, I don't really care what anybody thinks. Like if I'm a failure, so what? I'll just get back up and do it again. Like,
what age?
I wish I'd done that in my early 20s, but it took me until my late mid 30s to come to that realization. And I'm kind of like embarrassed about it now. It's like,
so, why?
Because it seems so stupid in retrospect, you know, that I'm just like, I wish I had known that in my late 20s, because I feel like I would be a lot further ahead than I am right now.
What could you have done to expedite that process?
I I mean, to me, it's just broken thought patterns, right? Like, I just wish I'd have had a level of kind of self-confidence that it just took me too long to get, right? Just like there's this, and I'm trying to articulate it, like this level of introspection about, mindfulness about saying, okay, I'm seeing my mind or my emotions drag me this way. And there are times now where it's like imposter syndrome is a great example. Like, people are like, what's the answer to imposter syndrome? Well, to me, the answer to imposter syndrome is you being mindful enough to say, that's my monkey mind trying to teach me or tell me to do something that's not in my best interest. Like, nobody really cares if I'm an imposter, because I'm not an imposter. Everybody's an imposter, which means nobody is. And so it's an idea here where it's like, it took me that long to really get comfortable enough to be mindful, to not be scared of all those things. And I don't know if I'm talking in circles or not, but that's how I think about it now. It's just like, oh, the way to get past that stuff is to recognize how you want to think about things and then tell your brain, this is how I'm going to think about things. And you just stick to it and be courageous.
Yeah. So what would you say if your son or daughter came to you and was like, okay, like, I don't think I'm good enough, or I'm scared of what other people think? Like, what's the advice that you give to them?
Yeah. Well, my kids are 17, so and 13, so they don't ask for advice. They still think I'm a moron. So it's totally fine. But let's
say they're 25.
Yeah, 25. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth in that situation. I would really sit down and talk about, like, let's understand how and why you're thinking about it this way. Like, tell me why you're worried about that stuff, and then I would really try to understand the foundation of where they're coming from. But in parallel, be accepting of it. Like, I think this is one thing we should definitely talk about as a theme. Is the thing I hate the most about, like, 47-year-old dude life advice to 25-year-old dude life advice. And how old are you now? I'm so sorry.
27.
27. Yeah, 47. Like, it's so annoying. Like so many times I hear, like, this middle-aged guy life advice. It's like, and look, like, here's my situation. I've got, like, some W's under my belt. I'm middle-aged. I'm a middle-aged white dude in America. Like, things are pretty good. Okay. Like, it's easy for me to be like, don't care about what people think. Well, like, yeah, of course. So that's what's so annoying is, like, so many times, like, you get these middle-aged white guy life advice and it's like, yeah, of course I'm going to tell you just be courageous. Like, or yeah, don't worry about that. Nobody cares. Well, actually, it's different when you're 27. That's kind of one of the things whenever I'm, like, talking to my son or, my younger son who's 13, like, I want to be very mindful to understand where they are in life, because it's radically different. And I think it's one of the biggest danger things that people at my stage in life do, which is, like, give you advice like 47-year-old me should hear, right? And that's totally different. Like, me expecting to have empathy for where you are in life, like, it's just so annoying.
Annoying. I understand that. But it's interesting how the problems at different stages of our life seem so important at that stage, but today, upon reflection, you realize how insignificant it is. Like, I often think about, like, popularity in high school or middle school and how that seemed like the end of the world.
Yeah.
And then you look back on it and you're 27, you're like, oh, that was no big deal. And it also makes me think about the things that I find important right now, like this podcast. Like, maybe in 10 years when I have children, I won't really care about the success or the people I talk to. Like, it'll just be extra.
Yeah.
So what's your take on that as a 47-year-old white guy?
None of it matters. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting and very liberating is you start to watch your parents and grandparents get older, right? How old do you have live grandparents now?
Yeah, I do. I'm very grateful that they're 82 and 85.
Right. So, were you? Let's see. So you would have been a teenager when they were in their, like, early mid 70s. So you haven't really known them as young, virile people.
No, actually, my grandparents are both young, virile, like, even at their current age.
For 80-something, yeah.
For 85 and 82. And, like, my grandpa ran marathons and my grandma's is full of energy and love. And so
that's great. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so thanks for ruining my example.
No. I got to give them a shout out.
Yeah. They sound awesome. They sound like you great genetics. But it's also, it's kind of interesting, right? You kind of day by day watch these people going from, your dad, everybody's dad at one point is the strongest He-Man in the universe.
Yes.
And then next thing you know, it's like seeing him in the hospital bed. And I remember that with my grandfather, right? Like, I remember I was 17, 18 years old and he was the strongest man in my life. Like, he was the last of, like, 9 kids in a West Texas ranch. Like, he was A&M college football.
Wow.
quarterback. Then they broke his shoulder, all this stuff, went to World War II, all this kind of stuff. And was like the strongest man I knew. And I remember being like a young teenager and walking in and seeing him in the hospital. He had just had a heart attack, and it was the beginning of the end for him. Like he went through a slow decline and died in his early 70s. And, I think there's a liberation that comes kind of watching the generations and seeing the mortality there. And then the other thing is, in your late 40s, early 50s, and on into your 60s, like you start to see the wheels coming off my bus, right? Mm-hmm. Like 3 years ago, I lost 90% of the hearing in one of my ears. It's called sudden deafness. It just happens, and they don't know why. 2 weeks ago, I was in the hospital, right? And it's just like, well, what happened? I had a GI bug. Well, it put me in the hospital. So you start to see like it's the inevitable decline, and I see that coming, like that whole thing. So anyway, I didn't mean to go super worse, but
no, but I believe you asked a 65-year-old what advice or what he learned from 50 to 65.
Yeah.
And his response was, we're mortal.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah. Like I asked, and I thought, well, maybe it was just this guy, but like I asked like 3 or 4 of them, because like my learning as a human, like business wise, like from like 37 to 47, I look at the delta of me to then to now, and it's enormous. Like my toolkit, and like I feel like I keep accelerating. And so I was like, okay, I'm so excited. Like, what's the next frontier? What am I going to learn? And so I started asking all these like mid 60-year-old guys. And it was all guys, because those are my business colleagues. They all said the same thing. They were like, no, you kind of stop learning. You just get old. You start to learn you're going to die someday. And I was like, wow, okay. This is why they spend $3 million on vacation homes. Like it's because they see the end coming, and they're like, well, what else are they going to do with the money?
Yeah. Wow. That's fascinating. So like you mentioned the huge difference between yourself at 47 and 37 as a businessman. What are some of the biggest things that you learned in that time?
Yeah. Look, I think as somebody in my late 30s, I was definitely like much more comfortable talking over people. Like there was a lot of times where I was the smartest guy in the room, and maybe it was true. But anyway, I'm not dumb. But anyway, so I would do that. I would be okay intellectually pummeling people and picking on them. I think there were things that I would do there. I think I had much lower kind of empathy and sympathy for other people as well in business type situations. And probably the last thing I would add, like, man, I sound like a terrible 30-something, huh? But, I think kind of there was a need for me to have more self-confidence in order to be a better supporter of leaders, if that makes sense, right? Like until you're comfortable really being in your own shoes and feeling like you don't have something to prove, it's very difficult for you to be the person behind the guy, right? And like in my early 40s, like I made a transition where I didn't feel like I needed to control things anymore. I didn't feel like I had something to prove as the leader of companies. And like, I feel like I'm much more happy with somebody else being in the hot seat and helping them be their best rather than trying to like have something to prove, right? And I was like, I've been CEO a couple of times, like I know how to do it, whatever. Like the other thing I want to prove, or maybe it's not to prove, but I want to be the best person to support those leaders to be the best people they can be and to achieve their goals. And that's much more inspiring to me, but it wasn't that way in my late 30s. Like I still felt like I had something to do.
It's funny because I talked to Corey Allen recently, and he said at 35, I stopped taking myself so seriously. And it sounds like that transition happened for you between 37 and 42 as well.
Yeah. I don't know. I've always been kind of a chuckle bunny. So
what does that mean?
Just kind of a goofball, like it's there's a few things I take super seriously, a lot of core value stuff. But then other than that, like it's just level, like I try to keep my mood just very much like not too high, not too low. Something goes good, I don't take much stock in it. Something goes bad, it's just another day, you move on.
Yeah.
So I don't know that, I see people that go through their life like very roller coastery, and I'm like, I don't see how that's fun. Just chill.
You mentioned core values before and how that's important to you. You've put out on Twitter about the importance of putting out an annual reflection of some sort,
Yeah.
where you kind of have to go through your values if you're going to reflect. And since this episode is coming out in the last week of December, I figured it would be a good practice to talk about what are some of the things you reflect on and what are some of the values that you make sure are most important to you as you enter the new year.
Yeah, 100%. So it's interesting about how I think I figured out what my kind of core values are. I started to watch the things that people would accuse me of or insinuate about me, and I would and the things that super duper bothered me. It's like
the triggers.
Like if you said, "Hey, Michael, you're kind of lazy," right? I'll be like, "Yeah, that's pretty true." Like I like to accomplish things, but I don't like to work. I want to work the absolute highest leverage way to get there, right? Hey, Michael. Hey, Michael, you're somebody who's not true to his word. I felt just the emotional response to me saying that about myself, that would make me the angriest ever. And like, I would just be like, no, that's not the way that's going to be. That's not the way we operate. Right. So like, that's how I started to discover kind of what my own core values were, as I would listen to my body and my emotions of how I would react. And which is kind of a messed up thing, because a lot of the times the universe is like, everybody's telling you like, oh, don't listen to your emotions. Like, don't be an emotional person. Like, and I just think it's such a load of horseshit. So anyway, so that's how I've kind of figured out what my core values are. Like, and it's a lot of this pretty straightforward stuff. Like, be true to your word, like be a dependable person. Like if you told me I'm not dependable, like podcast over. We're done. So
you showed up here on time. So that's pretty dependable.
Dude, it was close. I found like 3 things to distract myself with before I left the office. But yeah, so that's kind of how I think about my core values, and the kind of way I encourage other people to think about it is like, what are the things that get you so mad if somebody were to accuse you about? And then those are really your unique core values. But in terms of the reflection exercise, like, for me, I'm not great remembering details on anything. So like to compensate for that, like I design and automate things. Like I want to have systems and I want them to just work. And sometimes that system is the right person in the right role, but other times it's like, okay, like once a year, it's going to pop up in my inbox and I need to fill out this sheet. And that's how I go about doing the reflection stuff. And different people like to do it different ways, but I have basically a 1.5 page sheet, which has about 8 or 9 questions on it. And it talks about some of my wins and some of my losses. And a lot of times, like I'm such a forward thinking kind of thinker. Like I'll have to go back through my calendar and be like, what happened in January? Did I actually do any work? Yeah, that was good. Okay, put that down as a win. And then what that does is it ties me back into the practice of what happened last year. And then I worked my way all the way back to kind of what do I think is going right and wrong in terms of my day-to-day and the things I'm doing, and then what's really important going forward. So it's just kind of this segue from the end of a year to, okay, I'm going to start thinking about 2023 and I'm going to run my planning process for how I'm going to do the next year as well. And
when you look at that whole process, what is the number one thing that sticks out to you from doing it?
Yeah. The thing I think people don't ask themselves a lot, which I think is the most powerful question, is like, it asks you, what is your why? Like,
what is your why?
Yeah. Like, why are you here? Like, what really drives you? And for me, like a lot of times I've discovered those type of questions are very difficult, right? Like you can take years to try to figure them out. And it's one of the nice things about being late 40s, if you think about stuff for 10 years, is if you work on stuff for kind of 10 years, eventually you look up and you're like, oh yeah, like I figured this out. Like, and for me, like if you look at everything that I enjoy doing, it's creating opportunities for other people. Like I partner in everything. Like that is the core why of why I create stuff. Like I want to create joy for other people. And I do that by creating opportunities for them. Like we started a coding boot camp. Well, what does it do? It helps people change their lives by getting jobs, right? Like I've twisted fireworks into a way that's like, no, we're not in the fireworks business, guys. We're in the memory business, right? So like you see that theme kind of happens over and over again, or the co-working space we started here. Like it was like, it's an opportunity for people to like be part of a community, right? Like all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, like understanding what your why is and like, why are you doing things? And like, why do you really exist? And what drives you? Like, that's that best question in that sheet for me.
What do you recommend that somebody ask themselves, or what do you recommend people do if they're struggling to figure out their own why?
Yeah. I think there's a couple things to do. Number one is, time in the saddle like really matters. Like start doing the things that you're passionate about and the things that you end up with. And then you can really start to see the patterns there. And it's one of the gifts of being older is you're like, oh, like, like I've tried 3 different times to learn how to be a guitar player and it's not been fun any of those times. Well, it turns out I just actually don't like that. Right. So it's one of the nice things about, like, I have no musical talent whatsoever. But it's one of the nice things about getting older. But I think that's like the thing I encourage people to do, like, just be yourself. Be true to yourself, and then watch where those patterns come out and start to see. And then also, I think the second thing that's really helpful, if you can afford it for sure, is like having coaches on the side that can start to help you kind of see the blind spots that you're missing. So I've been really, as I talked about that kind of last decade being like a super period of growth for me, it's when I became open to coaching and development. Like I joined a CEO peer group, like I meet monthly with my coach, like he tells me, hey, do you know what I've noticed, this pattern of stuff you're doing? Or do you know which things do you enjoy working on? And I was like, well, I enjoy this one, and I hate this one, this one, this one. He's like, do you know what the pattern is there? I was like, no, tell me. Like, so that kind of coaching is another thing to do. And you can get that from peers, or you can get that from the internet, or I think the best is to have somebody that's like a professional coach, if you can afford it, like there and willing to give you, tough feedback and tough love.
And then you actually ended up starting a company with somebody that you met in one of these peer groups, right?
Multiple times. Yeah. I mean, cause like I'm the guy who's always like, I have more ideas than sense. Right. So I'm like, hey, do you want to start a coffee company? And I started a coffee company. And then I'm business partners with, another guy who's, in my group. And, we told everybody, hey, we're going to start this business together. So he and I did a private equity deal 18 months ago. So created really I guess now the biggest private tech company in San Antonio. We bought a bunch of stuff and moved it here. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty standard.
You know what's interesting about you is that it sounds really cool to own a bunch of different businesses. And I think sometimes people might try to go at that because they think it looks cool or sounds cool to other people. But from diving into your story and doing research and hearing you, it's just clear you like starting businesses. And you would do it whether people didn't think it was cool or they thought it was amazing. Like, it's just inherent to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important piece to note.
Yeah. Well, I think there's, for sure, to double click on that, I think there's 2 things. One is there's the enjoying the activities that you do. And that's kind of the algorithm I figured out too late in life, which is if you really want to know what your calling is going to be, don't focus on like the idea or the name of it. Like, I'm going to be a real estate broker. Well, actually, like, think about the activities you really enjoy the most. And like, I realized like I enjoy creating, like I enjoy working on interesting problems. Like I like to be in a creative space. Like I like to work with great people that I get to choose who I work with. Like I love people, just the right people. And like, once I saw that that was kind of the things that I enjoyed the most, then I said, okay, well, what kind of career do I want to have? And it just happens that owning multiple businesses goes really well with what I like to do. But then the second part is like, what are you wired to do? Right. Like, and I have this kind of fundamental idea that every personality is wired differently. And that doesn't mean there's any one right or one wrong role for in general. It means just for an individual person, like there's things that you're meant to do. Right. There are people that are people. I like people. I just don't like them as much as other people like people. But going to a cocktail party is like the worst thing. Like I get that is a huge anxiety thing for me. I'm just not interested in going.
What's going on there?
So I don't like, well, it's actually gotten even worse, with my hearing stuff, but I don't like unstructured, social interactions. I love meetings. I have meetings all day long. Objective, rules of the road, very structured, no anxiety there whatsoever. Like I can have meetings all day, or like a dinner party, just like, okay, structured, here's how it's going to work. And then 8:30, we're out of there, right? That's very good. But the prospect of navigating like the whole universe of like people at a cocktail party, like that's a totally different type social scenario. And I can't stand it. I will go to them because sometimes you have to, like you own a company and they're like, hey, we need you to show up to this. And I will go there. Yes. Hello, Mr. President.
You're Mr. President. In a lot of cases.
Yeah. We should also dig into that. That's, there's the downside of being the 47-year-old white guy, but so anyway, I think I just lost my train of thought I had a good point, but
the social anxiety.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So, Anyway, so there's that kind of free form social stuff is not there. And then it's gotten worse because of my hearing. There will be times where like at a bar or a cocktail party or whatever, I cannot hear a thing being said because I only have one functioning ear.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, you're sitting there and people are talking to you and you're like, yeah, that sounds great. And I wish it had like the Google Meet subtitles. It's like, what the hell are they saying, dear? And sometimes I'll just turn to my wife and I'll just be like, look, this is getting too much anxiety for me. I just need to go. And anyway, I'm Gen X, so we don't usually talk like that, but that's the way it is.
It's understandable. So you mentioned before about the downsides of being president or the downsides of being middle-aged white guy. How'd you phrase that exactly?
Look, I don't want to be elitist about the whole thing. So but it's one of the things that's been surprising to me as you start to become C-level whatever or founder of XYZ or whatever in terms of the hierarchy of human kind of social strata. Or there'll be times where like I just run into anybody, right? And it's like, hey, we're just normal people, you know? And it's like you and I are like, I think connecting very well and you're awesome and you're fearless and all that kind of stuff. But there are times when like literally I had a mentoring session with a 20-something couple earlier this week, and we spent the first 15 minutes just trying to calm them down because they were just intimidated, right? And by me, yeah. And it's like, well, don't be like, I change diapers just like everybody else does. Like it's just perfectly normal. But then the other thing that's been really surprising is I've learned that there are meetings and things like in companies or whatever in those social strata that I just can't go to because I ruined the meeting by being there.
What do you mean by that?
Like for example, like if you're the chairman of the board and you show up at a CEO's meeting, okay, everybody knows how the hierarchy works. In theory, they think you're the CEO's boss. Even though in practice, like I'm in there kissing the CEO's butt because I want to stay in the job. But like, yeah, our job as the board is to hire and fire the CEO and compensate them and make the ultimate decisions on the company. But really, like we see ourselves, and I see myself when I'm on a board as supporting that CEO. So I don't see them as anything other than a peer. Mm-hmm. Like that's how I see it. I see as partners in the way of doing this. And sometimes we have to put on our hire, fire, manage hat, right? But then like if I show up to a meeting, like let's say I go to the CEO staff meeting, when you're the chairman of the board, you think that you're just one of the guys or one of the gals, right? Or one of the theys. But, trying to totally be, whatever. But it's not. Like you'll be in that situation and like you actually like ruin the meeting. It's like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Like you ruin the meeting by just being there. And I used to, early on when I would get into multiple company ownership, like I would be the chairman. They'd be like, well, why don't you come to our staff meeting? It'll be so helpful. And now I'm like, not going, not going to be helpful because I would ruin the meeting. Because you think about just from a social dynamic, what happens when the CEO's boss shows up? Everybody suddenly becomes very differential to the CEO, or they won't say what's really on their mind, or they whitewash it because I may not have the whole story. Like it ruined the meetings, and it does it over and over again. So I just don't go to the meetings.
It's fascinating how like when social standing changes, how humans interact differently. And I don't know, it's wild to think about because I think we would inherently do this as well. Like if a person we really look up to or admire, like Warren Buffett is right here, you're going to be like, wait, this is crazy. And so somebody is viewing you in the same light. And so it's just an interesting thing. I don't know where it stems from and I don't know how to get over it. And I don't know, but I think having more conversations with people is one way to do it because you realize the similarities between people. You realize this is just a human being.
Yeah. It's just Mark Cuban or Warren Buffett or whatever. He just poops like everybody else does, right? Like, and I think it comes back to this idea of being mindfulness. Like that's the one thing, like I wish I had that earlier in my life and really practiced it more, which is being okay saying like my monkey brain is telling me to do this, or my monkey brain is telling me like I should be intimidated by this person. And I've been guilty of it tons of times where I show up and I'm like this person that I'm not even this person because I'm so intimidated by this other person. And I'm like, wait, why am I intimidated by this person? Like, I don't care. And so like, yeah, okay. Now the other side of that is I'm like, okay, well, have some it's the 47-year-old white guy problem. It's like, well, yeah, it's easy for me to say, like, just don't worry about that. Yeah, you just don't worry about it. Then I don't know the right answer. Maybe it's just one of those things in life that's just broken.
Yeah. Or you just got to live long enough to have enough wins to realize that everyone is is capable.
Yeah.
Talk to me about the going to Berkshire Hathaway, the general meeting. And this is how I stumbled across your Twitter. You were live tweeting the entire thing. I was like, who is this guy who is giving like a minute by minute update on what's going on? It was never a dream of mine to go. I'm not 40-year-old and white. I'm just 27. So it wasn't like I was thinking about it, but I was like, wow, this is fascinating. It's like a concert. It's like religion all mixed into one, it sounds like. Yeah. And I really got a good understanding, it felt like, from just reading your tweets as a journalist you were. So thank you for informing me. And what was that experience like for you?
It was great. And this happens to me sometimes where like I went on a food tour in Paris with my wife, and like I'll just kind of stumble into something. I'm like, I've got to live tweet this. By the way, I do have a draft thread that my wife won't let me publish, which was when we went to the mall together. And she's like, you can't publish that. I was like, okay, I won't, but it's pretty good.
I got to hear off camera at least.
Well, it's just like, I mean, there's just so many weird things in the mall that nobody really talks about. And like, you know, we're spending time in Nordstrom's or whatever. And I'm like you walk past and you're like, who is ever going to buy this? Like, one of them was like a beret with like rhinestone, like leather beret with rhinestone, like metal studs on it. And I was like, who's going to buy this? You know,
it's so funny that you say that, because I was driving here on the way to San Antonio and there's a billboard that's like 1-800 butt lift. And I'm like, I am just not the target customer for this. They must be making money, but like, oh my God, this is crazy that that's a service, or that's something that people are actually putting out there.
Yeah. The doctors all joke about it, especially like the pediatricians. They'll be like, you know, if you really wanted to make some money, you go like become one of those plastics. That's what they say. So anyway, my buddy is a plastic surgeon. He's got like 4 motorcycles, so whatever.
He must be doing well.
He's doing pretty good. He's hilarious. So back to Berkshire. Yeah. Look, I think
from butt lifts to Berkshire.
Butt lifts to Berkshire. Look, I think it's something to do at least once in life. And one of my big regrets from the 90s was, you know, I never went to go see the Grateful Dead before Jerry Garcia passed away. And I kind of felt like this was my year for Berkshire Hathaway. Like Charlie Munger's getting in his late 90s, and like he's an awesome guy to hear speak, and Warren getting to see the show. And then the most fun thing about going to Berkshire Hathaway is just all the people that go there, right? And it's like, you know, I think we're going to talk a bit about this as a theme, like what used to be the Catholic Church and this whole idea of religion has gotten radically fragmented, and some people have decided to go Berkshire Hathaway, and you'll see it. Like these people, like it's like a religious fervor in terms of how they think about their trust in Warren and Charlie and Berkshire Hathaway, and they're in there shopping and buying dilly bars and doing all this stuff, taking pictures and eating up the whole thing. And then you've seen other people who've replaced religion with their love of Elon and Tesla, right? And if you replace the way they talk about Elon or the way they talk about Warren with Jesus, like it all totally makes sense. Like it just all fits in there. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like I think people want to belong to something and an idea bigger than themselves. And it was great to go there and just be like, wow, this is what it's like going to a mega church. Like it's kind of like exactly that.
What did you learn? Like it was just the religion that was the big takeaway that you got, or is there anything else?
I think that was there. I mean, I think I was really surprised also with how much that has become a convention for people to spend time with each other and like connect over that type of, you know, compounding wealth and being patient and thinking about things with a lot of fundamentals. I think that was really interesting. Like I ran into one of my buddies who I knew from college, and it turned out he had been going there for going on 20 years now. And they would go every year, and they would go to the same steakhouse, and they would go to the meeting, and they would get together and talk about their investments. And it was kind of beautiful to see how it had become like not just one way, you know, with Berkshire to them, but also like their peer group type thing as well. I think the other thing that was super fascinating, you know, I'm a nerd about kind of watching generational differences, and you hear me talking about Gen X and stuff like that, was Warren and Charlie, their perspective on stuff. And, you know, it's kind of, there's a little bit of kabuki theater going on where they like ask different questions because Warren and Charlie want to talk about those things. So it's like, okay, well, here's, you know, Manish from India who has a question. And Manish asks, what's the likelihood of what would Berkshire Hathaway do if there's a nuclear war? Literally, that was the question. I was like, who asked this question? This is like, but it turned out Warren and Charlie really wanted to talk about it. Charlie had like some jokes prepared, and like Warren and those guys. But it was interesting kind of watching the generational difference where those two guys were adults during World War II. Like it's a totally different generation from my generation or your generation, where like they grew up during the Red Scare, like Khrushchev and those guys pointing nuclear missiles from Cuba, like just a different reality. And to them, like the idea of nuclear war seems pretty real. To you or me, like it doesn't seem very real to me because I'm like, whatever. Like they stopped doing air raid, drills when there was no more like stop, drop, and cover. Like by the time I was a kid, everybody got over that. But, back in the 60s, 50s, like they were terrified. And it still resonates in the way these guys act. And you also see it in like the way the folks that grew up in the Great Depression, the echoes of how they act and the lenses that they use to look at the world now are entirely different, right? Like Warren and Charlie don't use debt. Well, why don't they use debt? Well, because during their formative years, banks were not to be trusted. Margin basically ruined the country in the 20s, and it like resonates back. And it's just totally fascinating to see the echoes of that as they started to talk about, okay, well, what are we going to do about Geico's business? Well, they're using a lens that is totally based on how they were when they were kids and the world that was surrounding them at the time. Just totally fascinating.
That is wild. And what do you think is the lens that people are going to look at the world through because of COVID and 2020? Like, how is that going to impact behavior and shape generations in the future?
Yeah. Look, I'm not an expert on this for sure, but I'm watching it happen real time with my kids. One of the things I was told, which is fascinating, is the teenagers growing up right now, they are echoing the behaviors of my generation, which is Gen X, right? And so this, for example, is the first generation to view their parents as peers, as friends. That's one of the things they talk about it. Because what's very different was my generation is echoing how the generation that raised us act, right? The boomers acted a certain way with us, right? And it was like, okay, well, like, look, we're going to workaholic like crazy. That's what the boomers said. And Gen X said, nope, institutions are not to be trusted. And now you've got this situation where like the kids these days, literally, like I looked up one day and you know what my kids' wardrobe is? They're teenage boys. It's all my clothes.
Oh,
they just walk in and take my stuff because we're friends.
This is so interesting because I recently saw a trend on TikTok that was like my mom trying on my clothes and look how young she looks because of that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Like, and you're echoing that as well of, wow. And so like, does that mean that the generation that's coming up is going to believe more in institutions or more distrust? Because the way I view the world is like the world is going more and more distrust of institutions, but then like, your generation, how I think about it is like they trusted institutions in a way.
Yeah.
Or is that my parents who are in their early 60s?
So this is all generationalizing, but the boomers theoretically trusted institutions the most. I grew up in a time in the 70s and 80s when institutions were not to be trusted, right? Because we saw the unraveling kind of corporate America. And we saw that at the end of every school day, we were left on our own while our parents were off working. So we saw that you could only really rely upon the self. That was the self and the connections that you have, right? And you'll see every Gen X you kind of know. Like we have like, if you asked every Gen X, like, okay, something goes wrong and your house burns down, give me the 5 people you're calling in a row. They'll be like, boop, 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 boop. They all have that figured out, right? Because they don't trust any other institution, but they know they can trust this neighbor or this person or this friend. I think it's going to be interesting to see with Gen Z. I don't know what the prediction is on it, but my generation does not trust institutions at all. I do think you're seeing an interesting transition where, here, let me ask you a question. What brand or institution do you trust the most?
In what context?
Like you're going to give your money to somebody, or you're going to trust that they're not going to share your information with somebody else, or they're going to do the right thing by you.
Friends, or
But that's not an institution. It's like, like an organization. Well,
I would say like Joe Rogan is the first person to come to. Who do I trust that's like going to give me like actual information?
Yeah.
Is like more Joe Rogan than CNN.
Yeah, 100%.
That's how I view it.
Yeah, 100%. So this idea of people there, but I think you ask a lot of other people and they'll tell you they would trust Apple.
Apple.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So it's this idea that we've entered this crazy time where people are starting to trust commercial institutions to some extent the way other people used to trust the government, like the silent generation, the generation before the baby boomers. Like a lot of them used to put a lot of trust in the government and believe in the organization thereof. And now you look at what a lot of people are doing. They're like, yeah, I trust Apple or I trust Amazon. And you'd be like, well, why would you trust them? And it's because everything about them in terms of the way they're operating is very much like transparent. Why does Apple exist? They're making money for shareholders. We can trust that. Why does the government exist? Why does the Democratic Party exist? Why does the Republican Party exist? You don't know what's going on in the smoky room, so you've learned you can't really trust that stuff.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And I think it's also, you'll see people like Joe Rogan, and to some extent even me. It's like, okay, like you want to be trusted in media, like go be your real self. And like when Joe Rogan starts recording his podcast, like you'll see him like, hey Jamie this, or like they start recording before they're recording. Like it's like you're welcomed into his living room. It's really genius at what he does. Like it's all very calculated.
Yeah. And so take me through that of your decision to go into media, to go into Twitter. It's funny to call it Twitter media, right?
Yeah.
Like when you talk about it as like being yourself, like, but that's media. That's the modern day media. But why do you decide to start putting out your thoughts on Twitter?
Yeah. Well, I was bored during COVID. So like most things, my creative process is not like have a big vision and figure it out. It's like, well, I'm just going to go start stumbling that way and see what happens. But I think Twitter hit me at a place where Twitter is very hungry for people that are comfortable being who they are. Twitter is also a place that other people talk about it being very toxic. It's actually very nice to me because I am just like, I intentionally never say anything mean. I don't get into arguments. Like, it's just like, so everybody else's complains about their timeline. Like I don't at all. Like, I'm just like, but it's actually who I am, right? Like I don't have that mean bone in my body anymore compared to the 37-year-old I was, right? And you still see angry people on Twitter and all that kind of stuff.
But so at 37, you were mean or mean to yourself?
Both.
Both. Wow.
Yeah. But more so like I would be okay, like grinding on other people or being mean or grimacing and whatever.
Gosh, I can't imagine you doing a mean thing today based on your disposition and how you present yourself. It's fascinating.
I have real trouble. I don't like conflict. It's actually one of the things I really have to force myself to do is like have hard discussions. Like, and it's something I've gotten much better at because I would shy away from them or passive aggressively deal with them. And anyway, just coaching and becoming a better person, I think.
Yeah.
So, so anyway, back to Twitter and your questions around all that, like, and then I think Twitter, it hit into a great vein for me, which was, I love teaching. And the more I saw that I was able to help other people, like there's this karma bank that Twitter offers to you where like every time I deposit one util of stuff, I get 10 back. Right. And it's like, and I see it like just in this, like you and I get to hang out and you're like a cool guy. Like I'm excited about having this conversation and we're going places nobody else has gone with me. Like that's like quite an honor. And it's like, but why did I do that? Well, because I wrote this thread that, because it seemed like fun to write it about Berkshire Hathaway.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where it's all ended up. And it's a ton of fun. I really enjoy it.
One thing you said interestingly on a different podcast was that you expected it to be more of an external communication tool, you getting your word out to the people who you didn't know, I guess, in the world.
Yeah.
And that's obviously happened. But one unexpected benefit has been the internal communication of people who work for you who are like, oh, this is what Michael thinks about this, this, and this.
100%. Yeah. Well, and I think two things happen. One is like I read an article about Zuckerberg. Like they asked Zuckerberg, like, "Why are you doing this meta thing? Like, why are you talking to like what? It seems why don't you just have a town hall instead of ruining it?" He's like, "No, this is the only way I can really reach whatever 50,000 people he has working there at Facebook." And I was like, "Oh, that's an interesting idea."
Well, just to point out that what he did was he went on a bunch of different podcasts.
Yeah.
And those podcasts were the ones that Meta employees actually listened to.
That's great.
He was on Tim Ferriss, Rogan, and that or. and Lex Fridman. And so because of that, people heard what he actually believed about those topics. So I just wanted to clarify that.
100%. Yeah. So, but then also so I do this exercise every year where I ask my business coach to go help me, identify blind spots by going to work for the people, going to talk anonymously with the people that work with me. So confidentially, not anonymously. Mm-hmm. And they work with me closest and to get feedback to help me identify, okay, well, what do I do? What can I do better? Right? What are my gaps? What am I missing? Because, I think everybody, it's easy to identify the things you're bad at and that you're bad at. And then there's the blind spots that you just don't understand, right? There are a black box that you just put that in front of me. And there'll be a lot of times where my business coach tells me stuff and he's like, okay, well, what they're saying is this. And I'm like, nope, don't understand that at all. Nope, doesn't make any sense. And then they're saying, and then 2 or 3 meetings later, I'll be like, oh, I think I got it, right? I think I finally get it. And so he can become that translation layer for me to help me become a better person based on the data I'm getting, right, from him. And so he's like, the transformation I've seen since you got involved in social media is people feel like they know you better. And it's the people that work with you. And so that was the eye opener there. It's like, oh, like the people I work with are like listening to this stuff. So, hey guys, how's it going? I love you all. Please don't quit.
That's wild. And so I want to point out though, what are the things that you don't understand when the business coach says to you initially, like, you need to work on this, and what about that whole process don't you understand initially?
Here's an example. Like if you told me, Michael, like, we need you, we're hiring you for this job. Your job is to go develop relationships with this big corporation and work your way into doing a strategic partnership with us. Okay. That is something where it's like
right over your head.
I have no clue how to do that. Zero clue. And, that's why you look at maybe every organization I'm involved in, we have no kind of that type of business partnership kind of stuff. Like, it's just like, we don't do it. Cause to me, that's like just the most foreign thing possible. Like, I just don't understand how to do that. Right. And so what he will do is point out things like that, where it's like a black box that just, I don't have the capacity to actually understand. And he has to work over this, course of hours to actually help me understand it. And that's kind of what I'm trying to articulate. I'm trying to think of an example where he's done that. And maybe I'll remember one, but that kind of that idea where it's just like a black box that because of the way I'm wired, it's basically just impossible for me to actually understand it unless he really spends a lot of time helping me translate it. Like it's basically a foreign language.
Makes sense. Well, what would you recommend to somebody who's in the position of, okay, I'd like a business coach, but I'm just out of college. And obviously that's something that could be helpful. Where should they go? What should they do? What should they look for? Should it be friends, or what's your recommendation to somebody who's in their early 20s and doesn't have the means to afford one, or later on in life as well?
100%. Yeah, I think, that's where a business coach just isn't the idea of a single person in my mind. It's also who you surround yourself with, right? And who do you surround yourself with in terms of their ability to give you smart things that are going to be insightful to you? And then also, I think really important is, what is your set of tactics and approaches to get kind of information out of them, right? And so that can be everything from, inviting them directly. Hey, what do you think about this? Or what feedback do you have? You'll see me do little tactics like that on Twitter, right? Where I'm like, I'll write a thread and I'll be like, not sure I have all this right. What do you think? Right. And like, we did that like before the show. I showed you my AV setup and how it got better from the beginning to the end because I invited people to come in and criticize me. And I think you can have that disposition with your friends where you're like, how did this go? And you can do that in meetings as well. So one of the habits that EOS has, and then we like to do in all of our meetings, is at the end of the meeting, you rate the meeting and you say, okay, what was the scale of 1 to 10? If it wasn't a 10, you have to tell us what would make it better. And that does two things. One is it gives you actual concrete data that you can work on for next time in terms of tactics. And the second thing is it resets the attitude of the entire organization to understand, hey, this is a learning organization. We are all imperfect beings. And you can basically create those habits, I think, in a very strong way to get more data in terms of how to make yourself better. Because it's a real problem with American culture, right? Like, we act like we're direct, but we're not actually really direct. Actually, much more interesting is the way the English do it. Have you hung out with any English people?
Some, but not enough to understand the culture.
So a great example of the English people that and I hang out. My two best buddies here in San Antonio are both Englishmen. One's a plastic surgeon and the other one runs a healthcare company. And routinely they'll be talking and joking with each other. And I'm like, look, guys, you need to start speaking English because I don't understand any of this. I mean, they're saying English, but it's a bunch of stuff I don't actually understand. But like one of the examples that I like to talk about of English kind of saying things, but not actually saying things is like, well, I can't say that story actually. But it was like, one guy was overeating in a situation and another one's mom said, "Oh, wow, are you going to eat all that?" And they're like, "That's quite the plate of food," which was English code for, and they all understood exactly what it was. The Americans did not get it because we're like ostensibly too direct. But at the moment, like every English person at the table understood, "Are you going to eat all that, you fat whatever?" Because the person was unfortunately not managing his weight very well. But it's a situation where I think the English, to some extent, they don't directly come out and say things like if you give a talk in English and they walk up afterwards and they say, "That was a very interesting talk. That is code for it. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard."
Really?
So anyway, I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit, but there's some funny Twitter accounts about this. But that's one of the challenges in the English will, to some extent, they say it without saying it, but it's very clear, like when they're telling you stuff and you get feedback on things. But here in America, like it's one of the tragedies going on. Like everybody's so worried about each other's feelings that we don't ever actually slow down and like give each other help, right? And the love that comes from helping the other person be better. So you have to figure out ways to surround yourself with people comfortable with that and give them a safe space to be able to communicate that. And you have to invite it if you want to get any of it. And that's why I started doing this annual review process was like, I wasn't getting enough data. Like my business coach would be like, "How do you get better next year?" I was like, "I don't have any data. Let's go get some data." And so I've started to get much more aggressive about, I want negative feedback. Like give it to me because that's how I'm going to get better. That's how I'm going to do better next time. And that's part of the whole kind of goal of overcoming that American tragedy.
Well, it reminds me that it's the mix of curiosity and humility is asking for feedback directly and saying, what could I do better?
Yeah, 100%.
That question is both curious and like, I don't know everything. And because of that, it's going to lead to improvement and going to make people happier. You mentioned before about the EOS methodology. I'm curious, what is that?
So EOS is one of these kind of business operations systems, right? And there's dozens of these things. And it's basically the idea that every business tries to do the same things if it's going to run well, right? You're going to have high-performing meetings. You're going to have planning. You're going to have a vision. You're going to have a mission. You're going to have all this different stuff. You're going to have a competitive strategy. And then you're going to set goals, right? You like all kind of companies do these same things. And so EOS is one of these things that has taken all these kind of common ideas and put them into a system that I really describe as basically like business paint by numbers, where it's like, okay, well, like here's some worksheets, fill out these worksheets, right? And at the core of every single business is a front and back page of one piece of paper, right? And it's a one-page strategic plan. And so there's lots of systems that kind of do this. And basically what EOS does is it has you basically fill out these systems, follow these rules, fill out these forms, and you stop worrying about like what are our meetings going to look like, and you spend your time worrying about like what's going to make our customers happy. And so I use that throughout my whole universe, where it's just like, okay, here's this $10 book. Read this. Here are these forms. We're doing it this way. And for me, it's very powerful because I have a common language, and I know like at any time I can go walk in there and be like, "Show me your VTO," which is the one-page strategic plan, and I can know precisely what that business is doing from this week up to 10 years from now, because it's all put into that one front and back of a single piece of paper.
What does VTO stand for?
Vision Traction Organizer.
Vision Traction Organizer.
Yeah. So yeah, when you build a system like this, you have to take ideas that are very common, and then you have to give them specific trademarkable names so that you can sell it. So it's a one-page business plan. And basically at the front, it starts with kind of your core values, where you want to be 10 years from now as a company, and typically you define one or two numbers to do that. It could be like revenue or company size. And then it ties that all the way back to, on the other side of the page, all the way back to what are the goals we're trying to achieve this quarter and how are we measuring success. And where it's very powerful is like most things, it's kind of if I'd had more time, I'd have written you a shorter letter type thing. It forces you to be very brief. And the best VTOs are actually much fewer words than you think. They're several hundred words, but they're very precise in terms of the words they use, the numbers they use, and the economy of getting rid of everything that's not essential.
And do I have this correct where you saw this in a business, or you saw this in the business world and then you were like, I should just do this for my personal life too?
Yeah.
So take me through that process of going from business to personal in EOS and VTOs.
Yeah. Well, so I went through, I think, a period in my 30s where I was very busy. And I was heading directions, but I'm very good at like changing the goalposts. Like I'll be like, okay, well, this is what I want to do now. No, this is what I want to do now, and moving here and there. And I wasn't good at being self-disciplined to be like, okay, this is where I'm going. And some people do that naturally. You know, I've met people who are like, my whole goal in life is I want to be a general in the army, right? And I see them when they start their goals to do that when they're 12, and next thing you know, 45, like they figured out how to get there, and that's all they worked on. I'm not naturally wired that way. I'm too shiny objecty. So I knew I had to come up with a system really to overcome that and create more direction to go consistently. Otherwise, I'll just like, you know, shiny objects. I'm very good at shiny objects. So, you know, I got very familiar with using this EOS system, first running it in a family business and then running it in substantial businesses and then using it in everything I'm involved in. So I was like, you know what, these are some really good ideas. Like, why didn't I just fill out this form for myself and see how it looks? So I took the form and I removed a good chunk of it that wasn't really that essential for me personally, but I did the same thing. Like I picked a 10-year goal. So I have a 10-year vision of where I want to be a decade from now. I chose a net worth goal. And I'm like, okay, I want to be worth this much in 10 years. And I'm still working on that. So maybe I'll get there. And then like what my strategy is like, and I have a strategy, and I had to fill out the sheet, and it caused me to slow down and just think about it. And so I did that starting 2017. So I've been doing that for 5 years now.
Oh, wow. What do you think about like 5-year and 10-year goals in general? I assume you're a fan of it since you put it on your sheet, but how I've always thought about it is like, I don't know where I'm going to be in 5 years, let alone 3. So like, how can I plan effectively for that?
Yeah.
Because the world is constantly changing, and what I'm doing today wasn't possible 10 years ago. So if I'd put down, all right, I want to be a podcast host 10 years ago, which I didn't even know that was a thing that you could do. It's like, I didn't know. Right. So like, is that something that because you have greater understanding of yourself that allows you to do better? Or like, would you recommend this for somebody in their 20s as well?
I think that, well, we're back to the middle-aged white guy problem again, which is like, look, like I knew who I am now.
Yeah.
Like I know who I am. I know who I'm going to be. Like I've got a good idea of stuff. Like, I know I'm not going to be a guitarist. Just really bad at it. I am learning to speak Spanish though. It's really great.
I saw that.
It's the thing I'm most proud of.
I saw that on your reflection list.
I'm super proud of it this year. Anyway, we could talk about it.
Yeah.
If you want. If not, that's fine
too.
Yeah,
I do.
But yeah, so I think it is kind of the middle-aged man kind of thing that's easy for me to say. I think there's a lot of value to doing it at any stage in life. I think where somebody who is younger in life should be okay is just saying, look, I've learned a bunch of stuff and I'm going to radically change it. Like, I think that's okay. I think it's a mistake to not set long-term goals at any age, right? And to avoid those type things. And I did the other thing where I was like kind of aimlessly like, the whole kind of idea, which I hear people talk about all the time, which I think is just utter horseshit, is the, if you just have good habits every day, it all turns out great. I was like, no, it doesn't. like who thinks, I mean, just, okay, am I going to get to the top of Mount Everest and do anything really substantial just by like walking in a random direction each day? No, it doesn't work that way. Like you have to have a goal and you have to be optimized for it. If you want to do something meaningful, if you want to just do yoga and whatever, like fine. But if you want to achieve stuff, like you have to have like a vision and a goal and go after it. And, you know, I think when you're younger, you should pick those things. But you should also be comfortable with learning very quickly, right? Your rate of learning right now is incredible. Like, I'm so jealous of you, right? Just like I listen to my kids and they're like, literally, they're like, the other day they were blasting the Eagles in their room, the band.
They really are like your generation.
Yeah. Well, that was before my generation. Okay. Thank you though. Thank you for calling me old. But like my kids get to listen to the Beatles for the first time.
Yeah.
Like, I'm so envious, right? It's just like so cool. Like, I remember when I first heard like, Strawberry Fields, and it's just like, wow. And that can only happen once.
So the first can only happen once.
Yeah. But it's kind of the same thing. It's like, well, yeah, like be comfortable, okay, with that rapid progression of learning. That just means you need to move your goals differently than somebody at my age is.
Yeah. That's helpful and understandable. What else? What have you learned from your children? Like, I think we often think about the the parent teaching the child something.
Yeah.
But I don't think we often think about the children teaching the parent something. And if you're attuned to being humble, it feels like you are, that you would have some sense on like what your children have taught you.
Yeah. Well, it was always great because you'd be at your job and be like making big business deals happen and all this stuff. And you walk in and your wife's like, here, your kid puked, like, take care of this. It's like, oh yeah, that's the way it's going to be. I think I've learned so much about my parents and appreciation for them and my grandparents before them going through this process now, and watching how much my parents implicitly invested in us to become the people we have. I have a brother and a sister, so there's three of us. Like, I see how much we're doing for our children, and it's like that learning is like, oh man, like I appreciate my parents so much more every day because like that sacrifice is enormous and super, super magical there. I think that kids are great because they also remind you how resilient like the world is. Like both my kids have had significant health problems, through being young. One's going through stuff right now. And like, he's a great kid. Like he's doing amazing. And he went through COVID and then he went through like being homebound for a period of time, and it's still happening. And it's some of the stuff where it's like, he's 13 and like just being amazing. And it just reminds you like all at once, like we as humans are like so fragile, right? Like you and I could walk out and die right now, but all at once so resilient in terms of how magical it is. And it gives you so much of an appreciation for life to see that happen. So I don't know.
Do you feel as if you have greater perspective from being a parent?
So it's really interesting. Have you heard the theory that that parenting is like the world's greatest brainwashing?
No, I'm not at that stage yet.
Okay, so this is really fascinating. My friend pointed this out to me. So he's one of my mentors. He had two twins under 1 year old, and he had an adopted son under 18 months old at one point. So they had three children under 18, and they were all boys. And he pointed out to me, as when I was younger, and my wife and I were just getting close to getting engaged type stuff. And he goes, this is all brainwashing. And I was like, he's like, yeah. He's like, look at what the Marine Corps does to indoctrinate people. And I was like, okay, tell me more. He's like, okay, what do they do at the Marine Corps? They cross your boundaries of cleanliness. Kids do exactly that. They give you indeterminate kind of information, and they scream at you at random hours of the night. Marine Corps does that. Kids do that. They interrupt your normal sleep cycle. They keep you from sleeping normally and put you out of your pattern. Marine Corps, kids. Like you just keep going down the list of everything that you do if you want to indoctrinate somebody into a community and brainwash them. Like it's exactly what child rearing is.
Wow.
So that's why I always think it's pretty funny. Like they go survey people and they're like, okay, are you happier because you're a parent? And they all say yes. And I'm like, no, you're not. You're brainwashed, you sucker. You have no idea what's going on. Like, you just haven't figured it out yet.
Well, there's an important nuance between happiness and fulfillment, which I don't think is often talked about. It's like our aim so often is to be happy. Everyone, like, we've put happiness on a pedestal, but we haven't put fulfillment on that same pedestal in society at large.
Yeah.
And so being a parent, obviously, maybe you're not as happy, but potentially you're way more fulfilled.
Yeah, I think I haven't thought about that dichotomy. So do you think like you get to decide if you're going to be, do you believe the premise that you get to decide if you're going to be happy or not? Assuming you're mentally okay.
Yeah.
Not depressed.
I do think that.
Do you think you get to decide if you're fulfilled or not?
I think you can create the conditions to make yourself fulfilled.
Yeah. It's interesting. I wonder how much perspective is really the underlying thing around fulfillment.
What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, I think it's easy for people to look at life and be sad no matter what, right? My airplane is delayed 45 minutes. You mean the giant magic tube that was going to fly you across America in 4 hours for $250? It's the Louis C.K. bit.
That's great.
But it's totally true. It's like so much perspective, right? And if you look at like the perspective that different people have, you see these people in horrible conditions or horrible situations, and they're like totally happy. And it's like, well, why? And I think a lot of it is perspective in terms of you deciding what you're going to consider and then how you're going to think about it. Right. And I think like people ask me like, are you happy in San Antonio? And I'm like, I'd be happy anywhere.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. I would be a homer for whatever city I'm in, and I would be totally happy being there. And why is that? It's because I've decided to feel those two things. I've decided to believe them.
Derek Sivers, episode 249. Sorry to cut you off. Said the exact same thing.
Oh, cool.
About New Zealand.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd be happy there. It's too beautiful. No, just kidding. No, that dude's awesome. Super smart.
Yeah, but that's an important perspective. But in terms of fulfillment, it's like do you believe that you can choose to be fulfilled?
Yes.
Okay.
100%.
It's the same thing as happiness.
Yeah, I don't think there's any thoughts that you don't get the option to think how you're going to think about them.
I need to sit with that. You know?
Well, okay. So, and it's clear that I want to make clear there's a distinction. You get to feel, and this is all Eastern kind of Buddhism stuff. Like you get to feel anything, right? You can feel sad. You can feel anxiety. You can feel jealousy, anger, nervous, anxiety, right? And so like I talked about it let's talk about my anxiety of going to cocktail parties. Literally, do I feel anxious about going to cocktail parties? Absolutely. Am I going to be accepting of myself feeling that way and being okay with it? Yes. But am I only going to be okay that I'm going to decide how I'm going to feel and how I'm going to react to that emotion? I believe that everything is in that control of yours. You get to control every single part of that. And it's the difference, the Buddhists talk about are the monkey mind versus the conscious mind, right? And most people conflate those two things and they let them run amok, which is this idea of mindfulness. It's like, okay, no, I'm going to split and I'm going to tell that monkey mind it's going to think it can think whatever it wants, but the sucker in charge is going to own the situation. I believe you get to decide whatever you're going to think about that stuff.
It's funny because you don't get to decide your next thought often, but you do get to decide how you think about that thought.
100%.
And so for you, when did you realize you had a monkey mind?
I started to read a lot of the kind of Eastern philosophy stuff. So there was this time where the Dalai Lama was like super pop, like in the late 90s, like when Richard Gere was going over there. So I read a lot of his stuff. It was pretty good. And then some of the other, it started to creep into a lot of kind of Western popular books, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance and stuff like that. You would start to see some of the ideas show up there. There was a great book I read by a guy named Suzuki. It was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And I thought that was really...
Ken Suzuki, is that his name?
That may be, yeah. It was a long time ago. Yeah. I took the ideas and I forgot the book.
No, it's okay. That's the way it should be.
Yeah.
So we'll put those in the show notes.
100%.
Are there any other particular resources you found valuable on understanding the difference between your monkey mind and your conscious mind?
No, I think those cover it really well.
Okay. Because there does seem to be a level of peace to what you're talking about and to who you are and to how you present yourself. And it's so interesting to compare that to yourself 10 years ago, which you would describe as mean.
Yeah.
So it's just like, and you said you learned about some of those concepts in the 90s. So what happened? Like, what other factors are at play for like such a wide difference?
Yeah. No, I think being a curious person and just, I feel like I just operate like at a pretty high RPM of going through things and ideas and changing thoughts on it. Like I'm totally comfortable moving from one idea to the next.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, it's kind of like asking me like, that's just who I am. It's like, that's just perfectly normal. Like, it's like, and it happens with my wife all the time. Like we'll be in the middle of some conversation and I'll say XYZ and then we'll kind of pause for a second and I'll realize like I'm on 4 things down the road and she'll be like, okay, well back to this plan we just talked about. I was like, oh yeah, you're still talking about that. Like I actually moved on, I think about something. It's just, I don't know how to explain it. It's just how I'm wired.
So one of the things you're on to the next is learning Spanish. What was into the desire to learn Spanish and what have you learned about yourself from looking at the world differently?
I'm not as bad at Spanish as I thought I would be. But it's really fun. I mean, and I've kind of stumbled into this. So we were in, Marseille and Paris over the summer. So we went, it was like a great time to go to France, by the way, because like all the Parisians have been not had any tourists for a while, so they're like, American dollars, come on in, like, welcome. Would you like a table? Like so nice. And my wife and I work really hard to like fit in. Like we don't want to be the
American couple that everyone hates or something like that.
My buddies go and they're like, the French are such assholes. I'm like, well, tell me what you do. Well, I go over there and they don't talk English to me. I'm like, well, it's not supposed to work that way, dude. Like, it's like, did you check and, and they show up and they like underdress for everything. And like, it's like my wife and I got on Instagram and we like figured out, okay, we want to show the respect to the community and like be mindful tourists and all that kind of stuff and be good visitors. And, so anyway, like it was so painful spending time over there. Like I saw like I could have had such more of an opportunity if I'd spoken more than 4 words of French. And literally my French sounds like Elmo and John Wayne, like speaking French, like, au revoir, partner. Like it's that bad. And so like we had a guide in Marseille and she turns out her husband is a chef and like she's very knowledgeable, and it was like the hottest day of the year. And I talked to her about she actually does language tutoring. So now I started with her last summer. We do 1 or 2 sessions a week, 45 minutes. It's all conversational. So basically fixes the way like school language is taught, which is a lot of grammar and stuff like that. And it's all about like how do I like talk well if I'm like navigating friendships or like tourism or whatever in terms of these other countries. So we do that and spend a lot of time there doing that. And then I read this book, Fluent Forever, probably about 2 months ago. It's really great. And it talks about some of the science and ideas of how to learn a language more rapidly and how to retain it. So like I have a whole flashcard system now that I do, and it's turned into like a video game for me where I'm like on there, like, okay, what is the word for surprise? Like, how do I say like I made a mistake, And so that's all really helping to kind of grow my vocabulary, but I still sound like John Wayne and Elmo with a John Wayne accent speaking Spanish.
Well, so let me get this right. The coach that you got is French, but teaching you Spanish?
She's from the Basque Country and teaches me Spanish.
Cool.
Because she grew up speaking Spanish and English. So it's like Spanish, English, French, and she's married to a Frenchman. But what the coolest thing about it is, and I highly recommend this, is you get a tutor from one of these foreign countries and then talk about like how it's different. And so literally we'll have like these incredible conversations where she's like, okay, like, tell me how schools work in America. And I'm like, okay, well, here's how it works. Like, you get to choose what school you're sending your kid to based on the things you believe. And she's just like, what? You get to do that? Like, they would never work here in France. Like, okay, and like, tell me how the food system works in America. Okay, it works this way, and like, you get all your packaged food from here, and then the vegetables are sometimes. She's like, what? That would never work here. Just like, and then we spent a lot of time her sharing about like how business culture works in like these Latin American countries or the Latin countries, Spain, France, and stuff like that, and like. She was like, oh yeah, there's a reason Americans can't do business here. Like you guys won't do the routine right. Like for example, like, you go to a business lunch here, like you sit down and like you get right to business and do your work over your food, you swallow down your steak and you move on. Does not happen. It does not happen in Spain, for example, or France. Like you have to have the meal, then the coffee, then you can have a little talk about business, but the business actually gets saved for a later time. Like but like Americans show up and they're like, okay, John Wayne, like, let's do this. So it's like, it's really fascinating to have a tutor from a foreign country because you can really start to understand like the total differences in some of these places. And there's some cool apps to do it. Like a number of my friends now have like tutors in Venezuela and stuff where they're like learning Spanish too. So highly recommend it. And it can be very inexpensive.
Wow. Did you have any interest in learning languages before you did this, before going to France?
I had 2 years of junior school Spanish. So, and I learned how to conjugate tener, just to have. I think I had a little bit of interest in it, but I never really got my mind set on it. And that's kind of a pattern with me. Like every 2 or 3 years, I'll just really, really get into something and I'll go deep and then I'll get bored and then I'll move on to the next thing. So what you're saying is we only have you on Twitter for so long. I definitely could be, it's definitely possible. Yeah.
Are you getting sick of it? You're over it?
There's part of me that's like feeling like I'm starting to run out of stuff to say. I'm like, oh, all of my good stuff is said, but then it comes back again. So, I think what Twitter has going for it, social media has going for it is like that positive feedback loop. Mm-hmm. As long as that keeps going and like Twitter HQ and folks don't screw it up, I think it'll continue to be fine. So anyway, today was like huge. I've got like 2,000 like threads going. So I'm like, yeah, let's go.
I'm back. I'm fully on the train.
Yeah, endorphin time. Let's go.
Well, the reason why I ask about the language stuff is because I've started to realize that language is how we code our mind, and how we code our mind is how we operate. And you must get a new sense or a new idea for all the ways we do things based on learning a different language.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think another interesting thing I've noticed for that is like, there's this idea when you start to learn a new language, your primary language starts to suffer.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so it's this phenomenon where your existing words start to get replaced with other words. And then last night I actually dreamt in Spanish, but it wasn't that interesting. It wasn't like I was like, on a beach in Ipanema or something. It was like, I literally was dreaming about practicing Spanish, and I'm like, okay, tener soltura.
That's good. That's probably what we were doing as children, but we don't remember it.
Right.
Like dreaming about the language and building memories, because that's how we instill the truth of like what we're trying to get better at in anything.
And we want to live, my wife and I have talked about spending time in Spain or Colombia or Buenos Aires or something like that for some period of time, or probably end up in Mexico.
Oh, wow.
So that's one of the things I think we'd like to do, just to experience that.
It surprised me, since everybody, it seems like from looking at it from the outside, that you're the mayor of San Antonio. It seems like it basically seems like everyone knows you. You're the go-to guy. If you want something done in the entrepreneurial business scene of San Antonio, you know everyone. That's kind of how it's presented.
Yeah. Well, either that or there's not many other people on Twitter. I mean, I wish our elected officials would like get on Twitter and be real. Like I saw that guy from Miami, right?
Mayor Francis Suarez has come on the podcast.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know he had him as a guest. That's awesome. And he's a politician, so it is what it is. But he seems like a really nice guy. He's tweeted at me, and
that makes him super nice.
But like, politicians, like, it's so amazing to me. They just don't like slow down and it's created such a green space for me in terms of being on social media, where it's just like, oh, like just talk about yourself and be real. Like people my age have a ton of difficulty doing it. Like almost every single one of my friends is on Twitter, but never tweets a thing.
Why?
Never does. They're just like either totally confused by it or totally terrified by it. Like, and I do think you'll see people all the time that are like, oh, I want to build an audience on Twitter. And they're like 3 weeks in, they're like, this is so hard. Because like, I'm doing that on LinkedIn now, where it's like, you're just like posting into the ether and like going on to other stuff and being like, great post, dude. Like, nice work. Please forgive me. But yeah, and it gets pretty daunting, but like people my generation, like they just have such a hard time, like being real. Like I don't understand it. It's very fascinating to me.
Where does that stem from?
I mean, there is the idea that Gen X was wired in a way where we would come home from school and we were the original latchkey kids, and like you kept to yourself, and like it was still like in the 80s when I was growing up, it was much more dangerous then than now, but it was like super overblown. Like every stranger was like going to give you candy and put you in their van, and like it was a super terrifying time, and kids were on their own a lot. So we've learned to be these very self-resilient, like just keep our heads down, get stuff done, don't get in the limelight type thing. And that's the way most of my friends are. They're just like, I don't want to share that.
That makes sense, honestly. I remember there's so much of the advice that I was given as a child that today is commonplace, and it's like, all right, don't get in stranger's car. That's Uber, right? Like, yeah. Don't look at your screen too closely. That's an iPhone. Like, yeah. All this advice that we were given, it's like even the parents are doing it themselves. So it's just interesting how what's acceptable changes throughout life, and how the things that we're preaching today of what should and shouldn't be doing, how much of that is just social conditioning and how much of that is going to change in 20 years.
Well, and like you asked about my kids, literally my 17-year-old will say, hey, I'm going to go hang out with my friends, and walks up to his room. And we're like, okay, dude, that's not what that means. That means you leaving the house. But
That's like, you ever see someone your age say like, I'm going to go hook up with my friends. And you're like, okay, you're going to make out with them? Like, you're going to like, that's what my generation would interpret that as.
we don't say hook. I mean, I'm still young enough.
Okay.
We do not say.
Excuse me.
Yeah. How dare you call me old again? But yeah, no, we yeah, it's kind of bizarre watching the generations be very different. The other thing that's super interesting to watch is, what's going on with the baby boomers, right? Where these folks, like, you're seeing them go through a transition of working so hard and being part of these institutions and creating them in many regards. And for many of those folks, that sort of work that they were doing and the money that they had being a source of personal meaning
And fulfillment.
Yeah. And so now you're seeing, and I'm watching a number of them like do really well with it. Like my dad is amazing. Like he's done an awesome transition to live like his best life, like period. And then you're seeing some other folks that are like totally struggling with it. So I'd be curious to see how many do it.
I mean, how do you transition to a completely different part of your life? Like even for somebody in college who's listening to this and it's going to transition to working for the first time or starting a business, like that's a huge transition too. Like how have you found transitions to be most effective?
Yeah. For me, well, not to be a broken record, but it's this mindfulness idea, right? Yeah. Like you have to accept like, oh, I'm going to this new place. It's going to be uncomfortable that I'm going to have to meet new friends, right? Or it's, I'm going to graduate college and it's going to go from being very easy to meet peers to incredibly difficult. And like I looked at my transition when we moved back from San Francisco to San Antonio. I went from a transient city full of young people, very vibrant, people coming in and out, and we made friends like super quickly. There was always something to do. And then you come to a city like San Antonio and literally like my neighbors were like retirees. We lived in a nice neighborhood. So there was a Spur like across the street. I lived across the street.
Oh, wow.
Steve Kerr. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Steve Kerr lived across. Yeah. Wow.
So Steve Kerr would be across the street. Their house was much bigger than ours. Like we were in a starter home. And, but he would be across the street and like during trick or treat time, people would go over there and they would give out like the $4 Snickers bars and we'd give out the little like tiny Jolly Ranchers and the kids would be like, what's going on? Like, I was like, sorry, you need to go back to Steve's house. But I moved in and it's like these people have kids and like, the whole idea that you could have a friendship group just from being proximally located to people, like that to me was like a huge shift. Like I was like, oh man, I hate it here. Like none of these people are my friends, it's very different. And it took me a while to be mindful about that and think, okay, well, is this me or is this just like I need to act differently to this situation? And back then I was still conflating that monkey mind with my thoughtful mind and being like, oh, like, no, the problem here isn't that I'm a jerk. The problem here is that I'm just like using the wrong strategy. Like I need to be more thoughtful about this. And so I think that comes back to that idea as well. Like understand your situation is going to be different, accept those emotions you're going to have, whether positive or negative. And then you just say, okay, well, how am I going to react to this and go in that direction? So for me, that's worked every single time. I think I finally did figure out how to make friends as an adult. I can share that if you're
Please. Yeah.
So the tough thing is like all the way growing up, from a kid to high school to college, you learn how to make friends how, right? You make it with the people that are in the dorm with you and right next door, right? So geographically or proximally located, you make friends based on who's nearest you. But then when you get in adulthood, it doesn't work that way anymore. You're in this massive menudo of people and you're like me, where it's like, okay, these people have kids, these people are retirees, this guy's a Spur, like I'm not getting invited over there. No offense to Steve Kerr, but he was like a super nice guy and his wife was wonderful, but I have nothing in common with them. We're not going to be friends, like very different. So what I learned is like the key to making friends as an adult is you get out and you create activities or you go to activities and then you just start inviting everybody to go to everything. And so like now whenever I want to do anything, it's super fun. Number one, I just pick the thing I want to do. And then I just go invite like 30 people. And maybe everybody else figures this out, but like, and then like if 90% of them say no, or they have kids or whatever, like or they're busy with their kids, like I don't care. Cause I'm just like, hey, you know what we're doing? We're going to the downhill mountain biking park. And if you want to show up, that's great. And maybe 2 people show up. And worst case, I just go by myself and have a great time. And then like, I learned by doing that, going to my gym, going to do activities I liked, mountain biking, skiing, like I've created friends and it's all around shared activities and interests. And, that's the way I've created strong relationships. And it's not this geographically thing. And we don't tell anybody this when you're leaving. It's like, because you leave and you're like, well, wait, like, don't I just make friends with the person down the hall? No, it doesn't work that way. It's actually totally shifts when you become an adult.
Yeah, I really like that advice. And another thing that just popped to mind from you speaking is the idea of, what do you enjoy creating, and how can you find other people who also enjoy creating that thing?
Right.
Like, I like podcasting, so I'm attracted to other people who are also podcasting, or writing. I like writing, so I'm looking at other writers and trying to connect with them. And so it's like, for somebody listening, it's like, what are the things that you yourself like creating yourself, and then who are the people who are also creating things similar that you could connect with?
Yeah.
I think is an interesting way to do it as an adult.
100%. And that was like, I talked about the genius of Geekdom, that place here, which was designed to spurn startup and tech growth opportunity in San Antonio, which has basically had two major successes that have both flamed out. A company called DataPoint and then Rackspace here. And the idea was, how do we create more of like a tech community? And the insight that the Rackspace founders had when they put it together was, we'll just build a building, and then we'll invite all the tech entrepreneurs in the city, because right now they're spread out everywhere. This is a huge sprawling city, and we'll put them in one place, and then magic will happen. And it turns out it did. Like, a lot of really cool startups came out of it. And for me, like, I don't know if I'd still stuck it out in San Antonio if Geekdom hadn't existed. Like, my whole network, if you tie everything back to everything I'm doing, like, it all comes back to Geekdom. Everything except for the fireworks business.
Wow.
Everything goes back to Geekdom.
Geekdom is what exactly?
It is a co-working space located downtown. So
you created this?
No, the Rackspace founders did. So after they were involved in Rackspace, they wanted to grow the community here to help with Rackspace kind of talent acquisition and community development. So they started it with their own money. So Graham Weston and then a couple of the other founders got involved. And then Graham's like the godfather of tech here in San Antonio.
Cool. Well, you're the prince if you're not the godfather at this point.
I'll take whatever title people want to give me.
I like to end these podcasts with a challenge for people, because you listen, you enjoy it, and then what do you do and what do you take into your life to do the next thing? Does a challenge come to mind for you from our conversation, or something we haven't mentioned yet?
Yeah. I mean, I think especially if you're in business, like, I've written a few things that, if I had to pick stuff that people should just read, I wrote a thread on this idea of effectuation, which is a different type of startup methodology that's not very well known. But if you look at my kind of like stumbling through life, finding cool stuff, exploration style of entrepreneurship, like, it's super powerful. And if people are interested in something that's different than lean startup or different than kind of the classic waterfall model, I think it's a cool third alternative that's maybe not as risky, but still super very interesting and lucrative. So I would challenge people to take a look at that if they're interested.
Absolutely. So we'll link that down below. I appreciate you so much for your time, your wisdom, your kindness and generosity. I really appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you over the past hour and 45 minutes. And we will put your Twitter down below. Is there anything else you'd like to cover? Any topics we haven't covered? I know I gave you a long sheet of stuff.
Oh, yeah. No, I think it's great. I would love to pitch. I've spent the last 6 months building a course on holding companies. So Mirko, who is the producer of it, would kill me if I didn't promote it.
Of course.
But it's under pre-sale now. It's holdco.girdley.com. I put in everything I know about owning multiple businesses and running them at the same time into there. And it's the complete holdco course. So I could use your money.
and who should be purchasing this course? Who is it intended to help?
So it's optimized for anybody that wants to live kind of the lifestyle I've talked about of owning multiple businesses and doing the things like on a day-to-day basis to run them and or to find the right people to run them and then to support them and do basically live kind of the same lifestyle I live in terms of stuff. So you could be somebody that's getting ready to buy your first business or starting your first business, maybe a cash flowing business, and then you would be having a vision of buying more and acquiring other things and having those under your portfolio over time. So really tried to do it in a way which is pretty tough, starting for people who are pretty new with kind of business type things, maybe with a 0 to 1 kind of situation for their first business, but then also people who are kind of going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 kind of businesses as well, and gives you a whole playbook in terms of how to do that right, how to do that well, and how to avoid a lot of the mistakes that I made over the past 25 years.
Sounds very cool. And I really appreciate you coming here, talking about everything you've spoken about. Thank you so much for your time. And Anything else?
No, I think that covers it. Anything I missed?
No, I think we did a great job.
Should we rate the meeting?
Is that what happens at the end of Google Meet? You rate it?
Yeah, no. Well, you'll actually, like, say on a board deck, we'll have a slide at the end where it's like, okay, closing, rate the meeting. And literally it's an activity where you go around and each person says, rate the meeting 1 to 10. And then if it wasn't a 10, what's better for next time? And we'll make notes of those and then create action items of what people should do the next time around.
Oh, wow.
And in theory, each meeting gets better every time. And they call, at least for EOS, they call it a level 10 meeting because it's like, it's the most productive meeting of your week, right? It's like we pack that much into 90 minutes. And so we do that for board meetings. We do that for all kinds of work meetings as well.
It's a good little nugget to do if someone's going on the rest of their day. So
yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate you.
Sure.